stoned in the street for a crime she did not do. A cowboy stepped before the mob and gave her a name. The first rock was already in the air when I came around the corner of Dunnigan's feed store. I heard it before I saw it, that particular sound a crowd makes when it stopped being people and turned into something else. A low, wet sound like a single throat, and then the crack of stone on wood and somebody's laugh that wasn't really a laugh. I had a sack of oatmeal over my shoulder. 40 pounds. I remember that because of what I did next, which was set it down slow, right there in the dirt at the edge of the boardwalk, and not take my eyes off what was happening in the middle of Crail Street. There were maybe 20 of them. Could have been more hard to count when they're packed together like that, shifting, feeding off one another. A ring of men and a few women at the edges, and in the middle of the ring, on her knees in the dust, a woman I had never seen before. She had her arms up, the way a person holds their arms up when they've learned there's no point running, one arm over her face and one bent at the elbow, crooked up over her ear. She wasn't crying. I noticed that. She wasn't making a sound. There was blood on the side of her neck up into her hair, a dark line of it already drying in the heat. I stood there a moment. I want to be honest about that. I stood there and I took it in, and part of me, the part that had been riding alone for 11 years and minding its own affairs and staying out of town business, said, "This is not yours. Walk away. Get your oatmeal. Go home." I walked toward her instead. I don't know that I made a decision, exactly. It was more like the deciding happened in my boots before it happened anywhere else, and by the time my head caught up, I was already 4 steps into the street. I walked to the middle of that ring, and I stood in front of her. My name is Callum Rourke. I was 53 years old that August. I ran 60 head of cattle on a dried-out piece of land 8 miles east of Harlan, Nevada, and I had not started a fight or said 10 words to anyone in this town in 4 months. I was not known for being a man who inserted himself into other people's business. I was mostly known for paying on time and not speaking unless I had something to say. I put myself between the woman and the ring, and I looked at the man with the rock in his hand. His name was Detch Orville. He ran the dry goods. He had a red face and pale eyes and a piece of stone about the size of his fist. He looked at me the way a dog looks at a hand that's got between it and a bone, confused mostly, a little angry, deciding. I said, "Put it down." He said, "Rourke, you don't know what she—" "Put it down." The sound of the crowd changed. That single-throat sound broke up into pieces, separate voices, muttering, shuffling feet. Orville said, "She's a thief. Took Hendry's wife's necklace right off the—" I said, "Put it down. And I mean put it down on the ground. Don't throw it at me and don't throw it at her. Set it in the dirt." He looked around at the people behind him. Some of them looked back. A few looked at their own feet. The women at the edges had already started to drift away, the way decent people will when the spell breaks and they realize they've been standing in a road watching a woman bleed. Orville set the rock down. Not gently, he dropped it from about a foot up so it thudded loud and everyone heard it, his way of keeping something, but he set it down. I turned around. She had lowered her arms. She was looking at me from the dirt, dark eyes, the left one already starting to swell. Blood drying on the side of her face and down her neck. Dress torn at the shoulder. She was maybe 35, maybe 40, hard to know with a face that's been in hard weather. There was something about the set of her that told me she'd been in hard weather for a long time. She was looking at me the way you look at something when you don't know yet whether it's good or bad. Steady, waiting to see. I reached a hand down. She took it, got herself up. She didn't lean on me, just used my hand to get upright, then she was standing on her own. She was taller than I'd thought from seeing her on the ground. I said, "Can you walk?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Come on then." I picked up my oatmeal on the way past, and I walked her out of Crail Street. That's what happened. That's the thing I keep coming back to when I think about how she came into my life. Not some grand thing, not a speech. A 40-pound sack of oatmeal and 12 words and a hand in the dust. But it wasn't actually the beginning, not of what matters. The beginning of what matters was about 3 hours later, when I found out who she was. I'd brought her to the livery, Stave Harmon's place at the north end of town. Stave was the closest thing I had to a friend in Harlan, which tells you something about my social life. He was a small, quiet Scotsman who had come west 30 years ago and decided he'd rather talk to horses than to people, a decision I respected. He let me use the back room when I needed to be in town and didn't want to pay for a hotel. I sat her down on a stump in the back room, and Stave's wife, Nola, brought water and a cloth. I don't do well with blood and injuries. I do what needs doing, but I'm not comfortable with it. So I let Nola take over, and I went and stood outside with Stave in the alley and smoked. Stave said, "You know who that is?" I said I didn't. He said, "Elena Voss, or she was Elena Voss. She was married to Carl Voss, the one who had the silver claim up past Ridgeline. Carl died, 3 months ago now, before you came back from the mountains." I waited. Stave tapped his pipe against the heel of his hand. "There's a thing going around town, that before Carl died his silver came up missing. There was silver on that claim he'd shown a few people, a good amount. After he died, the silver was gone, and Elena was the only one there. So." I said, "So they decided she took it." "More than that, there's some saying she had a hand in Carl dying, too." I looked at the smoke coming off my cigarette. "And did she?" Stave shrugged. "Carl Voss drank himself near to death for 10 years before he actually did it. Everybody knew that. Woman stayed with him through all 10 of those years, which is more than most would do." He was quiet a moment. "But she's got no people here, no family. The Vosses are from back east, and they've already sent one of Carl's cousins out to look at the situation, and that cousin has been telling people in saloons what he thinks of Elena. And the necklace. Hendry's wife says Elena lifted it at the service for Carl. Elena says she never touched it. Hendry's wife found it in her own coat pocket 2 days later and didn't say so in public, but by then the story had already spread. I turned that over. The necklace was already back, already found, and they'd still stoned her in the street. I said, "Where's she got to go?" Stave said, "That's the question, isn't it?" I finished my cigarette, went back inside. Nola had cleaned the cut on her head, a shallow one, which had bled too much the way head wounds will, and done something with a cloth to stop the eye from swelling further. Elena Voss sat on the stump with her hands in her lap, and she looked at me when I came in with that same level gaze, waiting to see. I said, "Where are you staying?" She said, "I've been at the Crail boarding house. Mrs. Crail put my bags on the porch this morning." "Where are your bags now?" "Still on the porch, I expect." I said, "I'm going to get your bags. Then you're going to come out to my place for a while." She looked at me for a long time. Not warmly. Not with gratitude, not then. With the careful eyes of a woman who has learned not to assume that a hand offered is a hand given for good reasons. She said, "What do you get from that?" I said, "A cook, I was hoping. I have been eating my own food for 11 years, and I'm not good at it." The corner of her mouth moved. It wasn't a smile exactly, but it was the start of something. She said, "I'll need my bags." I said, "I'll get them. I want to tell you about the land before I tell you about what happened on it, because the land is part of it. 8 miles east of Harlan means you're up against the edge of the basin, where the soil starts to go from poor to worse, and the sage grows thick and gray, and the wind comes down off the ridgeline in the evening and smells like cold stone and pine and something else, something old, that I never found a word for. Not a bad smell. The opposite, actually, like something that has been there a long time and will be there longer than you. I came to that land 11 years before, in the spring after my wife Rebecca passed. I'd been up in Oregon before that. We had a place, the two of us, up past the Willamette, good soil, good water. We built it together and we ran it together, and we did not have children, which was a grief between us for years until we stopped grieving it and just lived with it, the way you eventually do. Then Rebecca got sick, and that took 2 years, and at the end of those 2 years I sold the Oregon place because I could not be on it without her, and I pointed myself south and east and rode until I found somewhere that didn't have her in every board and post and acre of it. The Nevada land was not good land. That was part of why I chose it. It asked a lot from you and didn't give much back, and that suited me for a long time. I had a 4-room house that I'd built myself, good and tight, nothing fancy. A barn that was better built than the house because I cared more about the horses than about my own comfort. A well that ran deep and cold even in August. 60 head of cattle that I ran myself mostly, with help at roundup time from a Paiute boy named Cutter who came by each fall for 3 weeks and left with enough money to winter on. It was a life, not an easy one, not a rich one, but mine. And I had arranged it over 11 years so that very little of it required me to deal with other people, which had suited me fine. All of that was about to change. I knew it on the ride out from Harlan, with Elena Voss sitting the spare horse behind me and 2 bags tied over the horse's rump. I knew it and I drove toward it anyway. She didn't speak much on the ride. Neither did I. That was all right. The high sage went past on both sides and the sun dropped toward the ridgeline and it got cooler, and she sat the horse well, not like a novice, not stiffly, like someone who had ridden a long time. When we got to the gate, she said, "This is a long way from town." I said, "That's the idea." She said, "Yes, I suppose it would be." We put the horses up and I showed her the house. It was, as I said, a house built for a man living alone, which means it was functional and not much else. A main room with a table and 2 chairs and a stove. A back room that I slept in. A third room that I used for storage, and that had a cot in it from the days when I'd needed a second hand around. I showed her the third room, and she stood in the doorway looking at it, the dusty cot, the sacks of flour and feed stacked along one wall, the single window that looked north toward the ridge. I said, "I'll clear the feed out tomorrow and get you better set up." She said, "This is fine," and she meant it. I could tell she meant it. I made coffee on the stove. She stood at the kitchen window looking out while the coffee came up, and I watched her in the way you watch somebody when they don't know you're watching, not intrusively, just noting. She had taken her hair down at some point, and it was dark, with some gray in it, and long enough to put over one shoulder. She held herself like a woman who had learned not to take up too much space, and who had also learned that was not necessarily something to be proud of, like she was working against an old habit. I put a cup on the table, and she came and sat, and we drank coffee in the evening quiet, and neither of us said anything for a while, and it was not uncomfortable. Then she said, "I want to tell you what happened with Carl with the silver." I said, "You don't have to." She said, "I want to, because you stepped out into that street not knowing anything, and you deserve to know what you stepped out for." I waited. She put both hands around the cup and looked at the table. "Carl found silver 18 months ago, not a great amount, enough to make a real difference. He showed a few people in town and they got excited, and then he went home and drank for a week because that's what Carl did when things happened, good or bad. I sent out letters to his family, his brother, back east. They came and they looked at the claim and they were very kind to Carl and very cold to me, and I understood from the beginning what that meant." She looked up at me. "Carl's family did not approve of his marriage to me. I was born in Hungary. My family came over when I was 9 and my father worked mines in Colorado until the mines killed him, and then my mother took us 3 children and we moved west again and she took in washing and I helped her, and that is how I grew up. I am not what Carl's family thought he should have." I said nothing. She wasn't asking me to say anything. Carl was sick when he found the silver, not from drink, not that time, his heart. He knew it and I knew it, and we didn't say it out loud because there was no point. So I knew when the silver came that I needed to protect what was mine, our claim, our work, because I had been on that land for 6 years and I had worked it as hard as he had, harder at the end when he couldn't, so I took the silver. She said it straight, flat, not confessing, not apologizing, stating. I took it and I put it somewhere safe before the family arrived. Because I knew if Carl died and the family came, they would find a way to say it was theirs and I would be left with nothing. And I was right. The cousin, Edmund Voss, came after Carl died, and he has been trying to have me charged with theft, saying I stole from the estate. But it is not theft to take what is yours. I said, "Where is it now?" She said, "Safe." I looked at her. She said, "Safe meaning I have it, and it is not in this county. I sent it east with a man I trust, a freighter I have known for years, and he's holding it at a bank in Salt Lake under my name. I have the papers." She touched the front of her dress lightly. "Here." I thought about that. So Edmund Voss can't actually charge you with taking it because you can show it was yours. In a court in Salt Lake, probably. In Harlan with Edmund Voss buying drinks for half the town. She looked at me steadily. "You saw what Harlan thinks of me." I had my 40-pound sack of oatmeal to remind me. I said, "What do you want to do?" She said, "I want to be left alone. I want to grieve my husband, who was a difficult man but my husband nonetheless, and I want to eventually go to Salt Lake and get my silver and start something new somewhere nobody knows me. That's all I want." She said it quietly, just stated it the way she'd stated everything. This is my situation, these are my facts, this is what I want. I said, all right, you can stay here while you figure out how to get yourself to Salt Lake. The room's not much, but it's dry and nobody will bother you here. She said, I'll earn my keep. I said I wasn't going to say otherwise. The corner of her mouth moved again, a little further this time. She said, you don't ask many questions. I said, I figure you tell me what you want me to know. She looked at me for a moment, that measuring look. Then she nodded once and stood up and picked up her cup and brought it to the basin and washed it, and that was that. What followed was a strange time. I'm not sure I have the words for it exactly, what it was like to have another person in the house again after 11 years. Not easy, not hard, like learning a different weight to everything. She was a worker. I say this not as a compliment exactly, more as a fact, the way you'd state that a horse has a good gait. It's what Alina was. She rose before I did every morning, and by the time I got up the fire was going and there was coffee on, and she was usually already outside doing something. Checking the hen line I had run along the south side of the barn, or carrying water, or standing at the fence looking at the cattle with that straight-backed, quiet attention she brought to everything. She cooked. God, she could cook. I had said it half as a joke on the day I brought her home, but it turned out to be a real thing. She could take what was in my sorry larder, dried beans, salt pork, a few winter squash I'd grown, dried chili peppers that Cutter had brought me the year before, and do things with it that I had no idea were possible. I had been eating my own food for 11 years, and I had grown so accustomed to it being bad that I had stopped noticing. The first meal she cooked, I sat down at the table and I ate it, and then I sat there for a minute not saying anything, and she glanced over at me and said, "Is it all right?" And I said, "There's nothing all right about it. It's the best thing I've eaten in 10 years. She turned back to the stove, but I caught the small change in her shoulders, a loosening. We worked the land alongside each other. I hadn't expected that. I'd thought she'd cook and keep the house, and that would be her contribution. But after 3 days of doing those things, she came out one morning when I was fixing a section of fence along the east pasture, and she picked up the other end of the wire without a word and held it taut while I worked. And after that she was just there at whatever needed doing. Not asking, not seeking credit, just working. She had strong hands. I noticed that early, the hands of a woman who had worked hard ground for years. The nails were short, and there were calluses on both palms and a scar on her right index finger from something that had happened long before I knew her. I noticed the hands the way you notice things that tell you something true about a person. We talked at meals in the evenings, not about large things, not at first. About the land, about the cattle, about what needed fixing and when. She asked intelligent questions, not the questions of someone humoring you, but the questions of someone actually wanting to understand. When I told her the water table on the north end was unreliable in late summer, she thought about it and said, "Could you run a pipe from the south well? It's a long run, but the ground there looks firm." And I sat there for a moment because that was something I had thought about for 3 years and not done. And somehow hearing it said plain made me realize there was no reason I hadn't done it other than habit. I ran the pipe, took me a week, changed how I watered the north herd. In the evenings she sat at the table and read when she had something to read, or she sat and looked at the fire. Sometimes she mended things, her own things, and after a while mine, which she did without asking and which I did not comment on, because commenting on it would have made it more than it was, or maybe less. There was a quiet between us in those evenings that was not the quiet of two people who had nothing to say. It was the other kind. I noticed things about her. The way she held a coffee cup, both hands always, like she was warming them even in summer. The way she said the names of things in English with the faintest trace of something underneath. Not an accent exactly, more like the memory of one. The way she laughed, which was infrequent and sudden, and not at all what you'd expect from a woman who held herself so carefully the rest of the time. A real laugh, a little rough, surprised. I noticed that sometimes in the evening she would go still and look at nothing for a while, and I understood that was about Carl, or about the last year, or about the full weight of where she had been and where she was now, and I left her to it. That kind of quiet is a person's own. I did not let myself think about what I was starting to feel. I was 53 years old, and I had loved one woman in my life, and I had watched her die by degrees over 2 years, and I had carried that around for 11 years after. I was not the kind of man who let himself start something he couldn't afford to finish. But there were moments, small, physical, specific moments, when I was aware of her presence in a way that had nothing to do with needing a cook or a fence hand. When she handed me something and our hands met for a second, and I felt the roughness of her palm against mine. When I came into the kitchen in the early morning and she was standing at the stove with her back to me, and the first sun was coming through the east window and laying across her hair. When she said my name, just Callum, matter-of-factly calling me into supper, and the sound of it in her voice did something to the inside of my chest that I did not particularly welcome, but that I was not, if I'm being honest, unhappy about. I kept all of that to myself. I was good at that. Edmund Voss came 3 weeks in. I was at the barn when I heard the horses, 2 of them from the south, the Harlan side. I came out and looked, and it was Edmund and a man I didn't know, a bigger man on a gray horse. Edmund rode like a man who had grown up in cities and learned horses late, stiff-backed, elbows out. He stopped outside the yard gate and looked at the house and then at me. He said, "I'm looking for Alina Voss." I said, "What for?" He said, "That's between me and her." I said, "This is my land and she's a guest here, so that makes it my business too." He looked at me with the clean distaste of a man who has always had enough money to look at people that way. He was maybe 45, well-dressed for the territory, the kind of face that had always been right about everything and had the expression to show for it. He said, "She has property belonging to the estate of my cousin. I've come to discuss the return of that property." I said, "Then you can get down and come to the porch, and I'll see if she wants to talk to you." He got down. The big man stayed on the gray horse and looked at me with the particular blankness of a hired man, which told me what he was there for. I went inside. Alina was at the table, she'd heard them come in, and she was sitting straight with her hands flat on the table and her face very still. She knew what the sound of those horses meant. I said, "Edmund Voss is outside." She said, "I know." I said, "You don't have to talk to him." She said, "I know that too." She was quiet for a moment. I think I should tell him to his face what I told you about the silver, that it's mine, that I have papers, that if he wants to continue this in a court of law, I'll see him in Salt Lake." I looked at her. "All right, I'll be on the porch." She said, "You don't have to." "I know," I said. "I'll be on the porch." We went out. Edmund Voss stood in the yard with his hat in his hand and his hired man behind him on the gray horse, and Alina came down the porch steps and stood in front of him, and I leaned on the post and watched. She was not soft with him. I want to say that because I think it matters. She didn't plead, didn't defer, didn't apologize. She stood in that yard with the August heat coming off the ground, and she told Edmund Voss exactly what she'd told me, in the same flat, honest voice. And when he started to interrupt, she talked over him without raising her voice and without looking away. He said at the end of it, "No court is going to side with you. You're a foreign-born widow with no standing." She said, "I have documents, and you have a cousin who drank himself to death and a family that never once came to see him in 6 years. A court will decide." He looked at me. I was still on the porch. I had not said a word. He said, "You should be careful about whose battles you pick, Rourke." I said, "I'm just standing on my porch." He looked at me for another moment. Something in his face wanted to push further, the kind of man who usually got to push as far as he wanted. But I am a man who has spent 53 years developing a certain quality of stillness, and I had it working for me right then, and he decided against it. He put his hat back on and got on his horse, and they rode back toward Harlan. Alina stood in the yard until the dust settled. Then she turned around and came back to the porch and sat down on the step and put her elbows on her knees and her face in her hands, not crying, just holding herself for a minute, just letting the tension out somewhere private. I went inside and got 2 cups of coffee and came back and set one beside her and sat down on the step myself, not too close, and we sat in the afternoon heat for a while without talking. After a while she said, "Thank you." I said, "For what?" She said, "For just standing there." I said, "Best thing I know how to do." She turned her head and looked at me, and I looked at her, and I held it steady because I was not sure what was in my face, and I didn't want to make anything out of a moment that didn't need to be made into anything. She looked back out at the yard. She said, "He's not done." I said, "No." She said, "I need to get to Salt Lake." I said, "I know, we'll figure it out." That word "we" sat between us for a second. Neither of us moved away from it. After that, something shifted. Not dramatically. Not in the way of stories where a door opens and everything floods in at once. More like the land after rain, you don't see it change, but the next morning everything smells different and the color of the sage is not quite the same as it was. She started asking me about Rebecca, not intrusively. It came out of a conversation we were having about the Oregon land, and I'd mentioned it in passing, and she said, "You built that with your wife?" And I said yes, and there was a pause, and she said, "What was she like?" Nobody had asked me that. In 11 years, nobody in Nevada had known enough to ask. I thought about how to answer it. She was practical, I said finally. Practical the way smart people sometimes are, where the practical thing and the right thing end up being the same to them and they don't understand why it's hard for anyone else. I looked at the fire. She worked hard. She was funny. Not obvious funny, dry. You'd be half a sentence past the joke before you realized it was one. I paused. She didn't complain. I mean never, not once that I can remember, and she had plenty to complain about. Alina was quiet. Then she said, "You were lucky." I said, "for a long time." She said Carl was not like that. He was a weak man. I say that honestly, not cruelly. He was kind sometimes, and he could be generous, but he was weak. He could not hold things. Anything hard came along, and he let it fall and drank to forget it. I spent 6 years picking things up. She looked at the fire the same way I had. I grieved him. I want you to know I grieved him. But I also grieved the man I had hoped he would be, and that grief was longer and older. I said, "That's a particular kind of hard." She said, "Yes." We sat with that a while. Then she said, "You've been alone a long time." I said, "Yes." She said, "By choice." I thought about that. At first, yes. Later, I stopped. Later, I think I just forgot there was another way. She looked at me. There was something in the look, not pity, not sympathy, more like recognition. The look of someone who has heard themselves in what you just said. She said, "I know that feeling." I believe she did. In September, Cutter came for the roundup. He was 22 that year, the Paiute boy, not a boy anymore really, hadn't been for a couple years. But I still called him that because that's what he'd been when I hired him the first time, and habits stick. He showed up on a Saturday morning with his rope and his bedroll and a tin of coffee beans he'd brought as a gift, which was a custom between us, and he stopped short when he saw Alina at the fence. He looked at her and then at me. He didn't say anything. Cutter communicated a great deal without saying anything. I said, "This is Alina. She's staying here a while." He looked at her again and then nodded once, and that was the end of it. By the evening meal the first day he was talking to her with the same ease he talked to the horses, which was the highest compliment I understood him capable of giving. Having Cutter there changed the shape of the days. 3 people working instead of 2, the roundup went faster. Alina worked the drives with us, which surprised Cutter enough that he said something about it on the second day in the indirect way he had. He said, "She rides like somebody who was born on a horse." Not to me, not to her, just to the air between us, which was how he made observations. I said her family worked mines. I expect she picked up horses somewhere along the way. He said, and after a moment, "She looks at you when you're not watching." I said, "Cutter." He said, "Just saying what I see." I didn't answer that, but I thought about it. There was a night in late September. The roundup was done and Cutter had gone, and the first real cold had come down off the ridgeline, the kind that comes in October now and then before summer fully gives up. A cold snap that makes everything smell like winter before it backs off for another month. I had put an extra log on the fire, and we were both in the main room, Alina reading at the table and me working through some account ledgers that I had been avoiding for 3 months. She put her book down and said, "I got a letter back today. From the freighter." I looked up. "The silver is safe, all of it. He sent me a receipt from the Salt Lake Bank." She put her hand over the front of her dress where the papers were. "So I have what I need." She paused. "I could go to Salt Lake and sort out the claim. It would take some weeks. Edmund Voss won't make it easy, but the papers are solid. I could get what's mine." I set the ledger down. "Good." She said, "After that, I don't know. I could buy a small piece of land somewhere, start something. I know enough about cattle now to do it small." She looked at the table. "I've thought about Wyoming or maybe further west." I said, "That sounds like a solid plan." She said, "Yes." She looked up at me, "But I find I'm in no great hurry." The fire popped. The cold outside pressed at the window a little. I said, stay as long as you need. She said, Callum. She said it the way she always said my name, plain, but with something underneath that I had been trying not to put a name to. I said, what? She said, I want to ask you something and I want you to answer me straight, because I don't have patience for things that go around and around. I said, all right. She said, do you want me to stay? I looked at her for a long time. I said, I'm a 53-year-old man with a poor piece of land and 60 head of cattle, and a house with one decent room. She said, I didn't ask what you have, I asked what you want. I said, yes. I want you to stay. She held my gaze for a moment, and there was something in her face that I could not fully read. It was not simple, not easily named. Like something long held was being set down gently. She said, then I'll stay. That's all, that's how it happened. She didn't come to me across the room, and I didn't go to her. We sat there with the fire between us and the cold at the window, and we just settled into what we had just said. The way you do with the true things. After a while, she picked up her book again, and I picked up the ledger. But the room was different. Everything was a little different. There is one more thing I have to tell you, and it's the thing I think you'd want to know. In October, Edmund Voss made his last move. He had not given up, I'd known he wouldn't. A man like that doesn't let go of what he thinks is his without one more try. He came with 2 men this time, not the hired man on the gray horse, but 2 men from Harlan, both of whom I knew slightly, Bud Garrett, who did occasional work for whoever needed it, and a younger man, Pickett, who was Garrett's nephew. They came at midday, when I was farthest from the house, at the north pasture checking the new pipe. Elena was at the house alone. I was on my way back, not hurrying, nothing had told me to hurry. It was a habit of mine to walk the south fence line on the way in from the north pasture, checking for breaks. I was on that fence line when I heard the voices. 3 of them and then hers, and the tone of all 4 of them was wrong. I came over the rise, and I saw them in the yard. Edmund Voss was on his horse. Garrett and Pickett were on foot, and they were close to her, closer than was right. Garrett had her arm. Elena was standing straight with her chin level and her face still, but her eyes were not still. They were lit with something cold and hard and focused. I was a long way away, maybe 150 yards. I did not run. Running when you're that far away doesn't help, and it tells the other men something they don't need to know. I walked at the pace I walk, which is not slow, and I watched and covered ground. By the time I was close enough for my voice to carry, Garrett had let go of her arm. Not because he'd made a decision, because she'd said something to him, quiet and flat, that had made him recalculate. I don't know what she said. I still don't know. Whatever it was, it worked, because he stepped back and he was looking at her differently when I came through the gate. I said, Edmund. Edmund Voss looked at me. His face had the quality of a man who had already done the math and didn't like the answer he kept getting. I said, the woman has papers for everything she owns. The claim, the silver, you've been told this already. I'm telling you again. He said, the claim still needs to be. The claim gets settled in Salt Lake in a court like she told you. You are on my land and you are going to go now. Garrett and Pickett looked at each other, then they looked at me. I am, as I said, a man who has developed a certain quality of stillness over 53 years. I had it working hard for me right then. Garrett said, Voss, let's go, I said, not loud, not theatrical, just the word. They went. Voss pulled his horse up at the gate and looked back at me. There was something in his face I couldn't name right away. It wasn't anger, not quite, or not only. It was more like he was seeing me clearly for the first time and deciding something. He said, what is she to you? I looked at him. I said everything I just said she is. A woman with valid papers and a legal claim, a guest on my land, and... I stopped for a moment, not because I didn't know what I was going to say, because I wanted to say it right. And she's under my name, I said. Whatever that means in this county, in this town, to you and your lawyers and anyone else who wants to come out here. She's under my name. Edmund Voss held my gaze for 3 seconds. Then he nodded, a short, tight nod, the kind a man gives when he's admitted something he doesn't want to admit, and he rode out. I stood at the gate until the dust settled. Then I turned around, and Elena was standing behind me. She was closer than I'd realized, maybe 6 feet. She'd moved up while I was talking to Voss, and she had her arms crossed over her chest, and she was looking at me with the steadiest look I have ever been looked at with in my life. Not soft, Not overcome, not performing gratitude, just steady. The real, clear-eyed look of a woman who sees exactly who you are and has decided that what she sees is worth something. She said, "Did you mean that?" I said, "Yes." She took a breath, let it out slow, and then she crossed those 6 feet and she put her arms around me, not gently, not tentatively. She held on, the way you hold something when you've been afraid it might go and then it didn't. I put my arms around her and I held her back. We stood like that in the yard for a while, with the October wind coming off the ridge and the cattle making their sounds in the north pasture, and the gate still swinging slowly behind me. And I thought, here is a woman who has been stoned in the street, who has lost a husband and a home and nearly her life, who has held herself together through all of it by her own pure backbone. A woman who had nothing and nowhere to go, and who stood straight in this yard and looked Edmund Voss's hired man in the eye and said whatever she said that made him step back. And she was choosing to be here, in this poor yard against this old chest. I held her tighter. She said against my shoulder, "What does it mean, under your name?" I said, "Whatever you want it to mean." She was quiet for a moment. I could feel her breathing slow. She said, "I think I want it to mean the most it can mean." I said, "Then that's what it means." She went to Salt Lake the following April. I took her there, the two of us riding out with Cutter for the first leg of the journey and then the stage for the rest. It took 7 weeks and Edmund Voss's lawyers were good and the judge was careful, and at the end of 7 weeks the claim was hers and the silver was hers and the whole ugly business was done. We came back to the Nevada land in June, to the house with the one decent room and the barn that was built better than the house. The sage was blooming, a pale purple gray that most people don't notice and that I had always liked, the color of things that persist. Cutter had been minding the cattle, and he came out of the barn when he heard us ride in and he looked at us and he said, "You took a long time," which was as close to a welcome as Cutter gave. We had been married for 3 weeks. We had gotten married in Salt Lake in a small office with the judge's secretary and a woman who ran the boarding house we stayed at as witnesses. Elena wore a dark green dress she'd bought from a shop on the main street, and I wore the coat I travel in, which was better than my work coat but not by much. And we said what needed saying, and the judge's secretary cried a little, and the boarding house woman shook Elena's hand and then mine and said, "You both look like people who have earned this," which was about the finest thing anyone said to us about it. The drive home from Salt Lake I will tell you about in one image only, because it is the one I carry. We had stopped for the night at a place we'd used on the way out, a flat above a creek, sheltered from the wind by a line of cottonwoods that had gone gold by then, early September. I'd made a fire and Elena was sitting close to it, turned a little sideways, watching the creek. The firelight was on her face. She had a blanket over her shoulders because the nights were cooling fast. She was holding her coffee with both hands the way she always did, and her hair was loose and she was wearing the green dress still. She'd been wearing it for 2 days and it had trailed dust on the hem, and she didn't care, and I loved her for that. She turned and looked at me across the fire. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me for a long moment with those steady dark eyes, and there was in the look everything that had happened, the street in Harlan and the stump in the livery, and the 11 years before she came, and the fence, and the north pasture and Edmund Voss at the gate and Salt Lake and all of it, every bit of it. And she looked at me like all of that had led somewhere she intended to stay. I looked back at her and held it. The creek ran past in the cottonwoods. The fire snapped. In the morning, we rode on. My name is Callum Rourke. I was 53 years old the summer I walked into that ring in Crail Street, and I am 58 now, and the Nevada land is better than it was because 2 people worked it instead of 1, and because she saw the pipe problem before I finished seeing it. The cattle are 80 head this year. The house has 2 decent rooms now. I built the second one the winter after we came back from Salt Lake, and it has a proper window that faces east and gets the morning light, which was the only instruction she gave me about the building of it. Edmund Voss did not come back. I heard from Stave Harmon that he had gone back east and the family had taken no further interest in the Nevada claim. I don't know what he told them. I don't need to know. The town of Harlan did what small towns do when they've done wrong and know it. It went quiet, and then it slowly acted like the thing had never happened. And then a few years later, some of those same people were friendly to us at the feed store and at church. Because that is the nature of people, and you either make peace with it or you make yourself miserable. And I had no interest in being miserable. Elena goes to church. I go with her sometimes. I am not a church man, but I am a man who goes with his wife to church sometimes, which I find is a different thing. There are mornings now, October mornings mostly, when the cold comes back off the ridge and the sage is still, and the sky is the pale clear blue it gets before winter closes in when I come out of the barn and I see her at the south fence, leaning on the top rail, looking at the cattle. That straight back. That loose dark hair with more gray in it now than when I knew her first, holding her coffee with both hands. 53 years old, and I had arranged my life so that very little of it required anyone else. I had thought that was the shape of the rest of my days. I cannot imagine now that I ever thought that was a life. She turns and sees me standing there, and she lifts her chin slightly. Just that, just a fraction, and goes back to looking at the cattle. I go in and put more coffee on. That's the whole of it.